I am an African.
Way into, I think, the piece of news I heard, and you wrote it down in your article, I believe, about the remains, some remains of bones of people that had died in the genocide in the early 20th century, being brought back to Namibia. And then also in the recent years, the last 10 years or so, there have been different pronouncements that have sort of indicated that Germany is acknowledging that it was a genocide. And yeah, I think recently there was, I think it's called the Joint Declaration. Basically, they both acknowledged that there was, mass atrocities, and Germany was going to pay 1.1, around that figure, 1.1 billion euros for development aid. So basically, the question is, I mean, Germany sounds like it's making the right noises, it's making the right pronouncements, coming to terms with its history. But at the same time, I understand the Herero, the senior chief among the Herero, refuted it and said, no, this is, this is insult to injury. Why can't this be a done deal? Why aren't people happy, basically?
It's a very complex issue. We would actually need 4 hours to break it down. Let me start by saying the step Germany made by giving recognition that what happened then was tantamount to genocide in today's understanding is actually a step in the right direction. And it's actually a very new step which sets an example. It's due partly to the pressure by the stronger post-colonial initiatives since the turn of the century, which also raised their voices in the UK and in other countries, and add to the pressure on governments to face the atrocities of their colonial histories and trying to come to terms. But indeed, Germany, as a world champion when it comes to the Holocaust, is the first country which in public acknowledges this in such a format. But while this is a step in the right direction, it also entered on a slippery road the way it was translated.
Okay.
And that has several reasons. One is maybe an international dimension. They are afraid to create a precedent for themselves, but also for other countries. And while I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories, I'm totally convinced that behind closed doors, the moment Germany announced that they are willing to admit that that was a genocide, which happened in 2015, and as a result, they initiated bilateral negotiations with the Namibian government, that from that moment on, it was not only carefully followed by other former colonial powers, but I'm absolutely sure it was a matter which was discussed behind closed doors in Brussels on the level of foreign European ministers. Because just imagine, Germany would give an unconditional recognition of the colonial atrocities. What that would imply for the colonial atrocities committed by the UK, by Belgium, by
that would be a ripple effect on everyone else. Yeah.
Absolutely, it would create a precedent and the pressure would totally increase. In the past, the Dutch and the British governments, each on one occasion, the British, in a court case, they lost with the of the Mau Mau, yes. They dished out some piecemeal compensation, but only to those who were still alive. Yeah. And the Dutch rendered an apology to the descendants of a village which was looted and extinguished in, I think it was the Philippines. Oh. But they were both very limited cases and both very carefully crafted to avoid a precedent. And that was exactly the context in which the German admission was then negotiated with the Namibian government. And part of these negotiations also entered some pitfalls by not really including in the sufficiently meaningful way the agencies of the descendants of those communities who were most affected, meaning the Herero, the Nama, the Banderu, but also the Damara and the San. These are the 5 communities in Namibia, which even in their totality are not a majority of the Namibian population,
I
which
see.
were not really invited to the negotiation table, which means from the beginning they felt marginalized, sidelined, not adequately heard. And their slogan they promoted in campaigns very early on during the negotiations was, if not with us, then it's against us.
So basically, it was a state-to-state type of relationship. And basically, the state, obviously, the government of Namibia had different interests than the actual descendants and the ethnic groups affected by them. And the ethnic groups are actually a minority when it comes to the demographic makeup of Namibia. And it's actually quite interesting that you mentioned that they're very careful with how they deal with it, because genocide, I understand, is a legal term in international law. And even the word apartheid is also a legal term. You look at the relationship with Israel and Palestine, the whole reluctance to have people call it apartheid is because of the legal implications also involved, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think there was also an issue with calling it reparations, I think. Like, nobody wanted to call it reparations, you know?
The term reparations is deliberately excluded from the draft agreement, which was initialed between the two special envoys of Germany and Namibia in mid-May of 2021. There is no reference to reparations. There is reference to a gesture of recognition.
A gesture.
Justice committed. Yes, a gesture of recognition. And they offer an apology, but the draft agreement already, just keep in mind the audacity that means. The draft agreement states this apology is accepted by the government and the Namibian people. So they initial a draft agreement where they decide that the descendants of the genocide accept the apology offered. I think this is just the arrogance of power, but not only from the German government. If I would be over Herero or Nama, I would be totally insulted, because they were not the ones who agreed to that draft. And now they are told, once that is put by ratification into a legally valid document, they are basically having declared that they accept the apology.
And sorry, I think you may have mentioned this before, but was there any consultation with the ethnic groups, the Herero people, between the German government and?
The Namibian government is eager to make reference that they had involved certain representatives of those groups in consultations and even had them invited to the table during the rounds of bilateral negotiations. But these were groups not representing the majority of those communities, but they were selected because of their closeness to SWAPO as the party which represents the government of Namibia. But that's not a fair and adequate representation of those communities. It's a political decision, and it shows the limitations of those bilateral negotiations. Now, having said that, of course, in the current system of international relations, these negotiations have to be initiated on a state-to-state level. But it does not prescribe to the government of a state who they are including or not. And it would have been entirely the free choice of the Namibian government to give the descendants of the local communities a meaningful representation and voice in these negotiations.
Hey guys, if you liked that video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
If you'd like to hear more of this, check out the full-length podcast on multiple platforms, including Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts.
See you guys there.